says, here we go again. A little bit different this time, and this is kind of recently a number of people have been asking me to answer questions on Quora. Now, I don't really know that much about Quora. Okay, I got everything in it. So many books. Okay, I don't really know that much about Quora. I just occasionally, if I've got a moment or two, I'll just go ahead, go through, and just answer questions that um someone requests, can you answer this question? Okay, I'll give it a shot. I think probably the most odd one is someone asking me to comment on Pakistani politics, and I know absolutely nothing about Pakistani politics. Don't know why they asked me to answer a question on it, but okay, whatever. And so it wound up being just a generic advice answer, if you will. Anyways, two things kind of just ground my gears. And this was research that was really started because of a question from Quora, and two stories that were force fed to me by Google/YouTube. Now, as you may or may not know, Google leverages the homepage newsfeed in the Chrome web browser for mobile devices to push news stories that it thinks, well, news stories that Google is being paid to push. Now, once you understand that somebody is paying Google to put X story in front of X user, you might begin to get a grasp on the political slant or what the idea to take away the rage, the reaction that you are expected to feel because this story causes X emotional response, regardless of whether or not the story is true. You just read the headline and you go, oh, that makes me so angry, or oh, that's so sad, or oh, what. And then on the other hand, YouTube routine. And I know that YouTube is siloing me. YouTube is filtering out content that does not align with the content that I post, and either post me more content that's in line with what I post, and when I go out and look for what the opposition is saying, then I get a stream of things that, well, really annoy the living daylights out of me. All right, so we've got two separate stories that just really ground my gears, and it's something I've been researching for a Quora question. The first was a story from Game Rant about how the Doll Corporation in Borderlands is ostensibly worse than the Hyperion Corporation. Now, this is actually, I think, a fascinating subject of how do the different corporations in Borderlands break down? How do they get to where they are? How did they get their power? Why are the corporate wars? I think the world building that Gearbox did with the first Borderlands and arguably even the second creates a fascinating perspective on socialism gone amok when you have socialism at a galactic level. But that wasn't the approach that the author of this piece took. I think her name was Jennifer. Um, Rather, the approach was capitalist greed. Now, there are two words that if you see anybody use without context, you can draw an immediate conclusion. That conclusion is these people have no idea what they're typing about or talking about or whatever. They have no idea about the subject they're trying to communicate. They are just reading off a scripted sheet of bullet points that someone else has given them. And ties in, and now we'll go on to the video that YouTube was absolutely convinced that I wanted to see. And it was somebody who was crafting an iron replica of a medieval torture device used in the 17th century to physically gag women because women were not allowed to be argumentative. While this is technically true, a lie by omission is still a lie. A lack of context is still a lie. Not saying something or not giving clearance of why this happened or what actually went on because it doesn't fit a political agenda is just as nasty as telling an outright fabrication. And so I feel I need to start on this first one. Yes, there were some awful things during the medieval period. Yes, in centuries past, in ages past, when one set of people sets out to destroy another set of people, or they set out to hush or silence another set of people, you would be quite frankly amazed at the weapons that will be dreamed up and the tactics that will be employed. Some of it really does beggar belief. And yes, in a number of cultures, women, because they were born a woman, were treated as property, literally no better than a bag of flour that you would pick up at the grocery store. Now, to the point, there is one major religion on the planet today that proclaims to be a religion of peace. It isn't. That considers women to be property, as in women are no more, women are equivalent to a refrigerator. Now, if you guessed it, it's the Muslim religion. Congratulations, you got the obvious. And here we go, being angry again. So, okay, let's bring this back to 17th century, specifically the 1600s, and the discovery or the settlement of Americas by the British, by the French, and by the Spanish. We know we would call it the East India Trading Company collectively because of the influence of pirates of the Caribbean. But at the time of the American Revolution, it was something like the Merchants Association of England or the United Merchants Association, something merchants. The East India Company had merged with a rival to form an even larger royalty backed conglomerate. Now, we have records from the merged East India Company, from the British Merchants Association. And what those records tell us, the communications that were made. Okay, we first have to establish something else here. Something that is true for all of the British colonies serviced by the British monarchies, uh, chartered. Sorry, my cat is being a little obnoxious right now. And I don't know if he's trying to tell me to calm down or he's trying to say there's not enough food in his bowl. And I just filled your bowl, so I know there's enough food in it. Okay. Uh, one of the things that it gets lost in history, gets lost in translation, but effectively every second country or every second nation to a port that the British landed at had an embassy or a trade delegation or people living near or at the British port where the Merchant Association landed. What this means is that from everyone along the East India's trade route, so that's Africa, what we would consider New Guinea, what we would consider the south of China, even what we would consider Japan in these days. Everyone that far out would have had a trade delegation within a British along the British trading route. Now, part of that is I'm going to use jetpack. It's going to take forever jumping. Now, part of that is because these national countries were keeping track of their interests, their trading interests along the British trading routes. And they were also trading with other countries that maybe Britain wasn't quite so friendly with. Say the French, the Spanish, the Egyptians, the Greek, the Italians. So that's important to keep in mind is that after the British first settled in the Northern Americas, they were not the only European country to do so, and they were not the only country along the trade route of the East Indies that possessed some kind of presence along the British trade routes. And that's important to understand. Now, Quora actually did the calculations out on how long it would take somebody at the farthest reaches of the East Indies Company of the Merchant Association trade route to get from one end of the world to the other, and concluded that on average it would take 5 months for somebody from the island that would become the nation of Japan, or known as the nation of Japan, to make it all the way to the New World. Okay, so now we've established that at the time of the American Revolution, the British colonies were not simply British subjects. Now, yes, the majority were British subjects. And yes, and this is very important in context, the majority of the localized government, the firefighters, the police, the law enforcement, beyond the police, the judicial system, the tax system, the public infrastructure system, everything that makes up the idea of a. Hang on, I'm getting called. Sorry, broken package. All right, anyway, so again, we have to keep in mind that the governmental infrastructure of the Northern Americas at the time of the American Revolution was, yes, it was almost entirely British. And that's a very, very important factor to keep in mind, the extent of the power of the British Empire and how far it stretched. But the British were not the only country with assets, with resources, with a presence in the Americas at the time of the American Revolution. We know from trade records that every other country that the British Merchants Association traded with had a presence in the Americas. Maybe not a large presence, but they had some kind of presence. We also know, again from trade records, that a number of these countries, a number of these national interests, where there was an established government for the British Empire to work with, promptly informed the British Empire during the American Revolution that if the British attacked their citizens, those national countries would be a little upset and would cease to trade with the British. This is also worth pointing out, or we are going to point out, this is the stage where we have observably other countries, notably France and Spain, arming the American revolutionaries and blockading British ships. Basically, Britain's largest enemies helped the British insurgents fight the British armies and the British Navy. And that's not something to so easily dismiss, is the impact of other countries, other nations on the American Revolution. They didn't just do it because they hated Britain. They did it because they had financial and human resources tied up in the Americas. A Getting rid of the British government made a lot of sense economically because they could probably get very favorable agreements out of whatever government replaced the British, because that government would be beholden to those other countries for having intervened. So even countries that would ostensibly have been as likely to attack each other as attack the British, say the French and the Spanish, would probably set aside arms for the time it takes to, um, well, stop the British from sending in reinforcements to the American Revolutionary Army. Now, I'm singling out the French and Spanish here rather than other navies because uh, I am aware of direct involvement between the. Uh, sorry, my cat has come back. I am aware of direct involvement of Spanish ships of the line interfering with British convoys, and I'm also aware of French naval blockades and French armament. So I'm singling them out not because they were the only ones, but because they're the only ones where I can go pick up a history book, an actual history book, and find specific records of where X ship engaged British Navy at X location, or X ship blockaded British ships from leaving British port at X time. So that's very important context to keep in mind, is why other countries were so willing to help the American Revolution. Wasn't just because they hated Britain, it's because they would get actual resources out of it. All right. So now we kind of move on to again, this is things that are captured in letters left over in families, held in vaults, sometimes photocopied, maybe in a library, or microfilm of people who were collectively around for the prior to the American Revolution, in the time between the first British colony, the first Spanish colony, the first French colonies, and the actual revolution itself. Now, one of the things that we know is that many of the colonists fleeing to the New World were Protestants. They were Christians who were effectively exiled by the Roman Catholic Church and the British Anglican. So I'm no, I'm trying to shoot for the OP pronunciation. I'm pretty sure I'm not landing it. The Anglican Church of England, who were persona non grata. They did not agree with church policies. They did not agree with the power that the church held over political decisions. And one of the big things for in the New World is you could practice your religion without oversight from a bishop or a cardinal that may just be an absolute prat. All right, so we've got the American revolutionaries who want more control over their own personal government because the British government is levying taxes that the American colonists are being forced to pay for. Give me a second while I figure out where I'm going. I'm heading for Striga. We also have a number of colonists who are there because they can practice the Christian religion without the burdens placed by the Anglican or Catholic churches. And we also have the influence of the German Lutheran Church somewhere in this mix. Now, this is important because, again, if we go back and we look at actual letters from people in the New World, from those early colonists, and especially what we're specifically looking for is we're looking for letters from colonists or people who were in the New World who were not British, French, or Spanish subjects. We're looking at the trade delegations, we're looking at the port miners, we're looking at the longshoremen who functioned for other nations' interests that were trading into the New World, and the letters that they were sending home to their family. Now, this is extraordinarily interesting because if we can dig up and look through those old letters, we find that there's a unique pattern when these people of that era are communicating how the new world is to their family and relatives in other in not the British, French, Spanish states, but in the states along the East Indies trade route and the states that are at least one step connected to the East Indies trade route. The reason why this is important is that one of the things they were expressing is that in this new world, in the Americas, women were not treated like dirt. Couples that would have been prohibited to marry and run away because um, a boy of one family loved a girl of the other family, and she loved him back. The whole Romeo and Juliet scenario. Families are at war. The couple want to go somewhere. Well, they could go to the Americas and set up a homestead outside of a British, French, or Spanish colony and effectively live a new life. In fact, we also know that a number of women in cultures where women were property sold themselves as brides just to get to a country where even if the husband that they were sold to was a sadomasochistic nut job, it was still probably going to be better. That person was going to be a better option than whoever they were going to wind up with for the rest of their life in their native country. I mean, go read Sarah Plain and Tall. Not quite as dramatic a this has got to be better than what I would be stuck with at home, but it gives you a good idea maybe of what a female of that era would be willing to go through to get away from the overt socialism. That is to say, the ideology where someone who controls the means of production is not responsible over regulating or exercising control over those who do perform the production. And if the production is kids, and you have somebody who's telling you, you can't mate with this person, you can't mate with that person, love has nothing to do with it, this is all about family and legacy and lineage, yeah, you kind of want to get to a place where you can get away from that. And that's what the New World offered. So let's flash forward then. We now have the setup that we want to accurately understand the allure of the New World. It's not just that it's a new that is an entirely new continent to explore with land that is yet to be farmed. It's also a place where the old social norms, the socialist norms, if you will, could be effectively discarded. Now, this isn't to say that those socialist norms were not applied to the New World. Again, the primary of the Northern Americas were British colonies run by British nobility who definitely were interested in keeping up the British nobility traditions of lineage and honor and vassals and servants. They were very interested in the idea of keeping. And again, looking back in history, the idea of slavery today is abhorrent to most people. What a lot of people may not understand in context is that of the era, slavery was probably not as bad as an option as you might imagine. And that is because in many cases, actually in 99.9% of all of the cases, slavery basically meant you were selling yourself to somebody who was promising to feed you, clothe you, teach you, and give you room and board as long as you were able to do a job. Now, in today's housing market, or lack of housing market, the idea of going to work for somebody who will feed you, pay your food bills, pay your clothing bills, pay your medical bills, and do all that for you, and all you have to do is just give them a day's worth of work every day, that may actually seem like a very attractive job opportunity. Now you're kind of going, but slavery was horrible. Yeah, because most of the records we have of slavery being practiced around the world, is where slavery was being used not as an alternative form of indentured servitude or where somebody is taking up a day job in return for clear and obvious benefits to somebody who can afford to offer them benefits. The records that mostly survive are the records where people were not taught. Now, in context is important, this makes no sense. Because if you are a farmer and you have a whole bunch of slaves who are working your farm, you really need them to be able to count. You really need them to be able to communicate. You really need them to understand that if you need 14 bushels set in warehouse B, 13 bushels in warehouse A, and 12 bushels in warehouse C, they better be able to communicate that kind of information. An uneducated slave is a waste of money who's not doing anything for your business. So, yeah, actual slave owners, and I mean the ones who were invested in their business, the capitalists, the ones who had controlled the means of production that were responsible, probably not actually that bad a life. We do know most slaves were actually educated, and in the slave market in Charleston, the only way slaves could function there is if they were educated. And almost any slave could be used from any particular residence in South Carolina to go to the Charleston slave market. So the idea that slaves were completely uneducated, taught not to read, okay, yes, that did happen. Guess who was responsible? If you came up with Democrats, you'd be right. And this is going to be a recurring theme here as we get back to looking at the American Revolution. Because when you come down to it, almost all of that British nobility who were in governmental positions or in military positions in the New World, in the Americas, they had slaves. They had people who were tasked with running day to day jobs, and instead of getting a paycheck, instead of being paid a financial sum for their work, they would instead be paid. I'm trying to think. I think I'm on to Paragon Island now. They would. Oh, there's a plaque back there I missed. They, instead of being paid a daily wage, they would be paid in food, board, clothes, medical attention. They would be paid in necessities. Now you're going, well, what if they wanted to go buy something? Well, what would you buy back then? I mean, honest question. What products would you buy? If your owner is already buying you clothes, if they're already buying you food, what are you going to buy? Books? Well, your owner's buying books. Toys? Well, no, not really such a thing as a toy industry. And again, we go back, we look at actual records. A toy workshop or a woodworking workshop was actually very common in those eras for households to deal with common items of furniture that may be needed or things that needed to be repaired. So if you've already got access to a wood shop, to a lathe, to the mechanical tools needed to make various items, you don't have a toy budget either. So again, what if you are in a slave position, what would you be spending money on? And if you're kind of raising your hand and going, yeah, well, I don't know, that's kind of the point. Again, historically, most of our records on slavery were influenced by all of the bad records, by all of the people who were abusive, by all of the owners who did drive slaves with whips, all of the owners who did not teach their slaves to communicate and wound up being right pains at the market because the owner wound up having to do all the negotiating because they didn't have any learned staff who could go do it in their stead. Now, that's just bad management. And again, we can trace political allegiance along this line by how these people were likely to vote, by what party they were registered with. And again, if you're thinking, wait a second, were all of these bad slave owners Democrats? Yeah. In fact, there's actually a very linguistic specific term used to describe these Democrats who had numbers of slaves that were uneducated. That term was carpetbagger. Now, if you're kind of going, wait, carpetbagger, isn't it someone who came down from the north? Yes, carpetbaggers were rich British former nobles who were kicked out of office or lost their fiscal wealth or lost their obvious fiscal wealth and ties and moved out of town because they were run out of town. They moved down south into the French or Spanish territories where they could again find an a footing of economics to set up shop on and resume their activities. And again, voting records and party registration can be kind of hard to hide if you know exactly where to look. So, again, we know most of the plantation owners who were aggressively abusive did vote for a Democrat part for what we would call the Democrat Party today. This is important not only for in terms of legacy because the party and its beliefs have not changed since its literal inception, but it does potentially give us other insight going back to the American Revolution. Now, in terms of, and again, and that's where we want to go back to. We want to focus in on the American Revolution. When British nobility, when British military decided that they had had enough of other British nobles telling them what to do from literally a country away, from taking their money, their hard-earned cash, from taking their hard-earned goods, from taking everything that they had worked for when the noble in the other country had done nothing, had just sat on their fat rear end and just decreed, you're going to pay me or you're going to give me 40% of that. And then we get the chant no taxation without representation, which is very important. The American colonists did not have a direct say in how their government was run, even if they were of British nobility. And this is an important factor when we actually get into the Declaration of Independence and of the start of the Revolutionary War, and that the Revolutionary Army wasn't just comprised of British nobles, British servicemen, the British common man, and everyone else who could lift up a weapon and join in on the fighting. The American Revolutionary Army was staffed by everyone who had a bone to pick with the British, and that included the Greeks, the Egyptians, what we would call the Chinese today, what we would call the Japanese today, what we would call the New Guinea people of today, what we would call the people of the Philippines today. All of those nations that had a presence in the Americas, in the New World, whose citizens had fled there to leave their home countries, they all knew what it meant if the British government were to win the Revolutionary War. It meant that they could potentially, for having even sided with the revolutionaries in any way, be packed up and shipped back home. Now imagine for a second that if you are a couple who fled the I'm missing a badge. I know which one I'm missing. Imagine that you are a couple who fled the Philippines because of let's say that you are a princess and you married a prince, or you wanted to marry a prince from another tribe. You couldn't do it because your tribes were at war, so you snuck onto a trading ship. You made it all the way to the Americas, and now you're living in the Americas. You're outside a British colony. You know that the American Revolutionary Army has gotten together, and you're kind of looking at each other and going, if we help the American revolutionaries, we can be pretty sure that they'll help us make sure that we're never sent back home, that we never have to face our nation. And, I could be executed, you could be forced to marry someone else. And, let's support the American Revolutionary Army. That's again, context is very, very important. And yes, many of the drawings, many of the information that we think we have about the American Revolutionary Army is solely focused on the British contingent, but that wasn't the only part of it. And that's very important to consider, in that the generals and those coordinating the American Revolutionary Army efforts, they weren't just protecting the citizens' property, they were also protecting the property of the trade delegations and the ambassadors and everyone else who maybe wasn't a subject of the British Empire, but did happen to be in the New World. That's a very important fact to consider. And the reason why it's important is because when we get to the end of the Revolutionary War, the British have surrendered, then Northern Americas are now free from British control and are setting up uh, their own country, their own form of government. They're not just forming a government in response to being anti-British. They're forming a government in response to all of the horror stories that they have heard about from everyone who was in that area. And again, we have to keep in mind that the colonies weren't really all that large. Communication between them had to be kept fairly simple. We're still in the days before the telegraph or the telegram, so everything either has to be in a letter or in person. So we're looking at firmly established trade routes and firmly established chains of communication. And when you're keeping in mind how easy the point here is locality, is keeping in mind that everything needs to be decided as locally as possible, because it's only the local contingent who really has an idea of what's going on locally. Locality matters. Again, this is major factor of the revolution itself. There was no locality between the British Empire and the American colonies. Decisions were being made by the British Empire regardless of how those decisions actually affected the colonists who were thousands of miles away in completely different circumstances. Case in point, let's say a British noble says you need to harvest 25,000 bushels of corn, but they're telling this to a farmer who only has enough acreage to harvest 14,000 bushels of corn. Now, the farmer might have all the labor he needs to harvest that much corn, but he's obviously not going to be able to harvest that much corn if he doesn't have the physical space to plant it. So, of course, when at the end of the harvest season, when the farmer has only harvested 14,000 of the demanded 25,000 bushels that the British nobility has asked for, under law, the British nobility could now punish the farmer for not making the quota, which meant taking a which could mean taking a greater percentage of the farmer's harvest, taking a greater percentage of the cash value from selling the farmer's harvest, to even up and arresting the farmer and taking direct control of the property itself. So, locality, actually knowing what's going on and having local detailed information in order to make government decisions was an incredibly important. You cannot understate the importance of this factor to the revolutionary government of the United States. It is very important. Okay? All right. So we can now apply this knowledge that we have over how the government actually had to function, how it was envisioned to function, and now we can start drawing some other observations. And this is a point I made on Quora that if we look at the actual list of electoral college names, some of the names on the list of the electoral college for the very first elections don't map to a common British nobility name. Some of them map to French names, some of them map to Spanish names, some of them map to Greek names, some of them map to uh, a Americanism or an English an English format of um, a Chinese name or an Oriental name, and some of them are decidedly feminine. Does this mean that women were actually allowed to vote in the first electoral colleges? Yes. If you're going, wait, women weren't allowed to vote until the eight whatever amendment. No, that's not true. Women were allowed to vote in elections before then. So what happened? Or what changed? That's a very good question that has an ugly answer. Now, for context, because I really am taking some of this completely out of context to make the point here, the practical reason that some of those feminine names showed up is that they were the wives of people who were killed during the American Revolution. Sergeants or captains or lieutenants or other officers or non commissioned officers, and they were allowed to vote as they now controlled the estate in the wake of their relative's death, and thus they inherited the British concept of they now owned the property, they were now a landowner, they could now vote as a landowner. Now, if you're kind of tilting your head and going, that's not what I was taught in school, damn right it wasn't, because it falls into it not teaching that the original concept in America, that the foundation of electoral college is predicated on the idea that the resources of the land and the management of the land are more important to the decisions of government than the populace itself. And again, this harkens back to the horror stories that the American Revolutionary government had inherited from everyone they had encountered in the New World. Again, going back to the example of the farmer who's told to harvest one amount, they can't possibly physically harvest that amount, so they get an anvil dropped, a colloquial anvil dropped on them because they couldn't do the impossible. That was the kind of behavior that the revolutionary American government wanted to squanch, to stop, to stifle, to make sure it never happened under the American government. So they decided that early on, the best way to stifle this is those who actually own the land, those are the ones who get to vote in elections. Well, here's the twist on that. What if your culture, religious or secular, details that women cannot own property? Well, that's now interesting because now we've gone from people who have inherited land because of the death of a husband who are now legally entitled to hold the land, can't hold the land because they were born a female. Yeah, that's where we really get into the fine details of why women were not allowed to vote in Americas, even though at the start of the Americas we have decidedly feminine names who are admittedly breaching the idea of British regulation to vote on behalf of their deceased spouses because they were legally entitled to do so. And that's also why the 19th Amendment and subsequent voting amendments are constructed in a way that they do, because they don't actually add any new text to the Constitution. They don't explicitly say women are now allowed to vote. What the Constitution actually says is that no law may be established that would prevent a woman from or prevent a person from voting because of their sex. Basically, what that means is that all of the state and federal laws that may have been enacted between or that were in place between that amendment are now effectively struck down. They are not enforceable. They are against the Constitution itself, which says that law cannot exist. And again, this is very important for context in that we're not just looking at, oh, women can vote. We have to look at, well, why were women not allowed to vote? Because culturally, many cultures decided that women were property. And if your game is to prevent women from voting, the easiest way to do that is declare that property cannot own property. You've now twisted the intent of the law. Landowners make the decisions into only male landowners make the decision. Now, again, by voting record, who made this determination? Well, we know by party records and voting records, it was the Democrats. If you're figuring out the pattern here, that the Democrats are the mustache twirling villains who have implemented every single policy that uh, stifled somebody, that stopped somebody from practicing a right, that forced a clarification that the Democrats' interpretation of how a law was should not be, you're now catching up to what the rest of us has known. Good case in point, very recent case in point, at least in terms of decades instead of centuries, is affirmative action. Now, if you go, wait, affirmative action is not bad. Is it? Affirmative action is racism. Affirmative action basically says that businesses must hire based on discriminatory practices. Businesses cannot hire based on whether or not somebody can do the job. Businesses must hire based on whether or not somebody has the appropriate skin color. That's racist. Affirmative action is racism, pure and simple. No, there's no way to sugarcoat it. It's racism. All right. So now that we can now go back again to the American Revolution and specifically to how women were treated. Yes, women were treated horribly by British nobility, who came out of a culture that, even though Britain had had its share of queens by then, the vast bulk of the British nobility within the Americas weren't so hot on the queen concept. And we've kind of seen this in recent years with Queen Elizabeth, where Parliament basically didn't give a flip about what the Queen wanted or what the Queen's interests were. They just did whatever they wanted to do. I really am looking forward to seeing how King Charles handles a parliament that does not fall in line with royal wishes. This may not end well for parliament. Uh, but so again, this is historical predication, and this is where again, we have to go back and look at the American Revolution and specifically the government powers in play, because the Democrats didn't exist at the creation of the American Revolution and the establishment of the revolutionary government. No, they did. The Democrats existed. And if you're tilting your head and going, well, how does that work? Quite simply, we're not looking at specific party identifiers. We're not looking at how people label themselves. Because you can call yourself anything. I can call myself Mickey Mouse. That doesn't mean I'm Mickey Mouse. I can just call myself Mickey Mouse. What matters is what I do, how I behave. And that's where we can look at ideology. What do these people believe? How do these people implement what they believe? What actions do they take? And this is where we come back to the extreme extrapolation of the ideology. Socialism is the ideology where those who control the means of production are not responsible. Capitalism is the ideology where those who control the means of production are responsible. And from this, we get a natural extrapolation that the socialism ideology maps to the Democrats. More regulation, more government control. Government is the answer to everything. You didn't build that. And on the flip side, we have the extreme implementation of capitalism, which is anarchy. And if you go, wait, anarchy? Okay, what is the natural extrapolation? I know there's a badge around here somewhere. I'm not even close to it, am I? Nope, is that it's down here. All right, anyways, and if you go, okay, anarchy, okay, what is the natural extrapolation of give me liberty or give me death? What is the, yeah, that is the key phrase here. Give me liberty or give me death. What if you are willing to die if you'd rather die than have a government over you? What is that? That's anarchy. Anarchy is no government. So anarchy can be cleanly mapped to where everybody is responsible for their own actions. Now, this sets up a very violent conflict between the two because under the socialism ideology, it is perfectly valid to use force to make somebody to take control over somebody else. You control the means of production if you're not responsible, but you're allowed to use force to take whatever's not yours. On the contrast, the uh, capitalist ideology at its extremes devolves into we're not dating, get your hands off my wallet or I blow your brains out. And if you're going, oh, yes, that's the point. That's how dramatically opposed these ideologies are. One of them advocates for physically taking something from someone else that you did not earn, and the other one advocates for violently defending yourself against anyone who tries to take something from you. So now that we've established where our ideologies sit at, the actual extremes of what each ideology means, we can now also correctly identify what capitalist greed means. Capitalist greed would be when somebody who controls the means of production and is responsible for the means of production keeps all of the profits to themselves and don't ever pass any of that profits along. Somebody who abuses the people under them, even though they did some of the work, they're not willing to do what's right for the rest of the community or the rest of everyone else who lives in the area. It'd be like a farmer who harvests 25,000 bushels of corn and then keeps all the bushels of corn for himself because he harvested them, is his corn, he can do what he wants with it. And you're kind of going, well, what about all the people around you are starving? If you sell that corn, no, it's my corn. I did all the work. I get to enjoy it. I get to do whatever I want with it. I'm going to burn it. That's effectively what capitalist greed should mean. If you're not using capitalist greed in the context of somebody who has gone to the far extreme of anarchy or someone who has gone to the extreme of hoarding out of selfishness, then you probably don't really have a good grasp on economics. And you probably don't have a good grasp on where capitalism actually stands as an ideology and how it impacts business decisions. A more moderate capitalist stance is we made a product, we're going to sell a product, we want something out of this product because we were involved with this product. Somebody who finances a new restaurant, they financed it, they have an expectation that they should get some money back because it was their money on the line to finance the new restaurant. And this is where we get into what are the Republicans? The Republicans are the balance. They are the centrists. The MAGA group, the conservatives, they're the center because they're the ones who are trying to find a balance between the extremes of I get to keep it all and you don't get to keep it all. They're the ones who try to find a balance between, okay, this is a fair price to sell it. This is what you probably should sell it at. You get something for your work and other people get the benefit. So again, and I realize we've gone into economics 101, but this is again very important to understand the actual differences between capitalism and socialism, especially in an economic sense, especially looking at the formation of the American Revolutionary Army and how the American Revolutionary government outlined how the government was going to function, because none of these decisions were made in a vacuum. None of these decisions were made without an understanding of what there is of what other nations, other countries had done or had gone through, or what had been done to other nations or countries. Okay, I'm heading in the right direction. All right. Is Sarah Moore moved? Uh, is that where I came in at? Oh, yes, that's. Sorry, I'm getting all turned around because I normally make the molehill run coming this way. That island is where I want to go. All right. So again, we're going back to the American Revolutionary Government, how they constructed everything. Again, it's not a government formed in isolation. It's not a government formed without input from a number of new American citizens who weren't part of the British Empire. And where are you? There you are. And there we are, mole point unlocked. All right. So, anyways, what is that again? Going, this links back to the comparison of Dahl Corporation to Hyperion Corporation in Borderlands, and where I need to address another subject. And this is very important to understand. Corporations are a socialist construct. They're not a capitalist construct. Again, the idea of socialism, the ideology is you control the means of production, but you are not responsible. What is the purpose of a corporation? Now, if you're kind of tilting your head and going, to make money, no, that's not the point of a corporation. The point of a corporation is to give a legal shield to those operating in the corporation. Basically, you get to treat the company as a person rather than treating the people inside the company as individual people. It is effectively a legal shield against financial attacks. Uh, I guess as I'm trying to simplify this way too much to make the point here, because just saying a corporation is a legal shield doesn't quite capture what a corporation is supposed to do. But for legal intents and purposes, a corporation almost solely exists so that no one person can be held legally accountable for actions that the corporation takes. Hang on. Okay, that was actually an offer to go get some food, and I'm not going to turn it down. So I'll wrap this up here. Um, the Quora question, and I'll address it now in a later stream, was, should we change up to make the presidential election separate from the House and Senate election so that the president runs on a different schedule than the House or the Senate elections? The reason why I wanted to go through all of the previous detail over the context of the construction of the American Revolution and American revolutionary government, how it's not just isolated former British subjects without the input of anybody else constructing the government, is the British subjects in contact with every other country the British Empire ever encountered, all trying to figure out how do we stop all of the abuses that we had before, and effectively failing to do so because they had not ejected, or rather, the British nobility class. Here's a central point to make. At the start of the American Revolution and at the end of the American Revolution, the infrastructure of government, the idea of, again, I said this earlier, the idea of law enforcement, the idea of a fire brigade, the idea of public service, tax collectors, road management, anything that we would attribute to the government today, or as a logical government service today, was controlled by British nobility, and those nobles didn't go away overnight. They were still there. The mayors, the chiefs, the whatever you want to call them, were still in office. They were still mayor of Charleston is still mayor of Charleston before and after the revolution. Okay, maybe not a good town name because I don't actually know that it was the same mayor through the revolution. Originally, Charleston mayor may have left, but for other towns, you still had effectively the same people in political power, and they still made their same. They had, and this is a very important they had input as well. And some of the decisions that the American Revolutionary government made may have been constructed in such a way that there was already a way to twist the idea that would then form the basis for the later amendments to clarify that no, you can't actually trust the idea of how this country should work like that. That we're going to stop the federal and state level laws with a constitutional amendment because that's not the intent of what the Constitution theoretically laid out. Again, so I'm hungry. I'm going to go get food now, so we'll come back to that later. Uh, but I hope I've at least addressed the idea of the Northern Americas. Yes, predominantly British, not only British. The American Revolutionary Army, yes, predominantly British, not only the British. In those other countries, those other experiences, those other people interacting with the British, those help create the foundation for the American government. And that's an important contextual factor that cannot be simply dismissed and brushed aside. And I'll go into this more later. For now, I'm